The day Mae Whitaker buried her husband, she drove a fence post into the earth beside his grave and told the assembled mourners that anyone who thought grief would make her weak had another thing coming. That had been 8 months ago, in the spring of 1882, when the Texas panhandle was still green from an unusually wet winter, and the sky above the Whitaker homestead stretched so wide and blue it looked like something God had painted on a slow afternoon. Thomas Whitaker had died on a Tuesday, thrown from his horse while trying to chase down a spooked calf in the north pasture, his neck breaking clean on the hard-packed earth before Mae even had time to run from the porch. She had held him in her arms for an hour, rocking him like she used to rock their daughter Lily, who was 6 now, and understood that Papa was gone but not entirely why the world had to work that way. Mae was 28 years old, brown-haired and sun-darkened, with hands that had known hard work since childhood and a jaw that set firm when her mind was made up. She had come west from Missouri at 18 to marry Thomas, and in 10 years of building something together on this patch of land outside the small town of Breckin Springs, she had grown into the land itself. The soil knew her footsteps. The creek that cut through the eastern edge of the property gurgled over stones she had once placed there to ford it cleanly. The oak tree in the south yard had a carved initial in it from the year Thomas first kissed her under its branches, and Mae had pressed her palm to that carving every morning since he died, just to feel connected to something that would not disappear. So when Harlan Briggs rode out from town in late October, his black coat too fine for the dust, his boots too clean for the trail, and sat himself on his horse at the edge of her porch and told her he wanted to buy her land, Mae did not even blink. She told him no. Harlan Briggs was 45, the sort of man who wore wealth like a second skin and expected every room he entered to rearrange itself around him. He owned the largest cattle operation south of Amarillo, a bank share in Breckin Springs, and a reputation for getting what he wanted through patience, and when patience failed, through other means that folks talked about quietly over coffee but never loudly in public. He smiled at me the way a man smiles when he thinks the opposition doesn't know the rules of the game being played. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, tipping his hat with elegant insincerity, "I understand this has been a difficult season for you. I am prepared to offer a sum that would see you and your daughter comfortably settled in town, a proper house, no more of this." He gestured vaguely at the wide, empty land around her, as though the homestead were a problem rather than a life's work. Mae stood on her porch with her arms folded. "This land is not for sale, Mr. Briggs. My husband died on it. My daughter was born on it. I will die on it myself before I sell it to you or anyone else." Briggs nodded slowly, as though she had said something mildly interesting. "You've got a mortgage note coming due in March, I'm told. With your husband gone, I wonder how you plan to meet it." Mae's chin lifted by a precise quarter-inch. "That is my business. It will be the bank's business come spring," Briggs said pleasantly, and turned his horse and rode back toward town at a comfortable walk, as though there were no hurry at all. Mae stood on that porch for a long time after the dust of his horse had settled, staring at the horizon where Thomas's grave sat under a simple wooden cross near the fence line. The mortgage was real. Thomas had taken it to buy seed and new fencing 2 years ago, and the annual payment in March was $140, a sum that right now might as well have been the moon. She had 20 head of cattle, a small vegetable plot, and 2 horses. She had no ranch hands anymore because she could not afford to pay them, and she had been managing the animals alone while also tending to Lily and keeping the house and mending the fence and hauling water and every other necessary thing that filled a day from dark to dark. She was not afraid, but she was calculating, and the numbers did not look good. 3 days later, a man rode in from the North Trail and asked if he could water his horse at her trough. Mae was in the yard splitting firewood when he arrived, her hair tied back with a piece of twine, a light sheen of sweat on her forehead even in the autumn cool. She looked at him the way a woman alone looks at a strange man approaching her property, measuring, assessing, deciding in seconds whether the situation required civility or the shotgun that leaned just inside the door. He was on a bay horse, a good one, lean and well cared for. The man himself was perhaps 30 or 31, tall even in the saddle, with a dark hat pulled low against the October sun, and trailed dust on everything from his boots to his collar. He had an honest face, which meant nothing on its own because me had met dishonest men with honest faces, but there was a quality in how he sat the horse that spoke of someone accustomed to long days and open country, someone at ease with space and silence. He held his hat when he spoke, and his voice was low and direct. "I would appreciate it," he said simply. "Been a long ride." Me set the axe head down on the chopping block but kept her hand near the handle. "Water's free," she said. "Help yourself." He dismounted and led the horse to the trough near the fence and stood quietly while the animal drank, not looking around the property in that calculating way that Briggs's men sometimes did. He just waited on his horse, patient and unhurried. "You passing through?" me asked because it was a reasonable question. "Looking for work," he said. "Heard there might be some ranches hiring around Brecon Springs." "Most hiring is done in spring," me said. "I know it." He pulled the horse back from the trough and ran a hand along the animal's neck. "Name's Roscoe Crawford. I appreciate the water, ma'am. Mae Whitaker." He nodded, put his hat back on, and gathered his reins. He was about to remount when his eye caught something me had been trying to fix for 3 days, a section of her nearest fence that had come apart at the post, the wire sagging badly, the board split and dangerous. He looked at it for a moment without speaking. "That's been giving you trouble," he said. "I know what's giving me trouble," me said. He almost smiled, just the corner of his mouth. "I could fix that before I ride on, takes about an hour." Me studied him. "What do you want for it?" "A meal if you have one to spare, if not, nothing." It was not the offer of a con man. Con men did not offer to take nothing. Me considered for another moment and then said, "I have a pot of beans on the stove." "That suits me fine," Roscoe Crawford said, and tied his horse and went to work on the fence like it was the most natural thing in the world. Me watched him from the porch for a while, half pretending to shell peas, actually watching his movements. He worked with efficiency and care, not flashy, not rushed, setting the post true before he attempted anything else, testing the tension of the wire with his hands before he stretched it, tapping each nail with measured strikes. He had done this kind of work many times. When Lily appeared in the doorway beside me, wide-eyed and curious, me put a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Who is that?" Lily asked. "A man fixing our fence. Is he nice?" "Too soon to say," me told her, but she went inside to check on the beans and added an extra piece of cornbread to the plate she was already setting. Roscoe ate at the kitchen table with his hat on his knee and thanked me for the meal with a sincerity that did not feel practiced. He answered Lily's questions patiently. What was his horse's name? Jupiter. Was Jupiter a fast horse? Fast enough. Had he seen Indians? He had met some Comanche people once, and they were just people, same as anyone. Lily seemed satisfied with this answer. Me noticed that he did not talk about himself unnecessarily, did not spin stories or make himself sound important. He simply was what he was, a working man who knew fences and horses and had good manners at a table. Before he left, me said, without entirely planning to say it, "I could use a hand around this place. I cannot pay much. $30 a month and a bunk in the barn is the best I can offer." Roscoe turned his hat in his hands twice. "That's fair enough," he said. "What work needs doing?" "Everything," me said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "All right, I'll start in the morning." He stayed in the barn that first night, and me lay in her bed listening to the quiet that had been too quiet for 8 months, and felt something shift slightly in its quality. Not comfort exactly, not yet, but possibility. The kind of possibility you do not let yourself name too early, because naming things early is how hearts get broken. November came in cold and steady, and Roscoe Crawford turned out to be exactly what his hands and his manner had promised. He was up before dawn every morning, and when me came out to start the kitchen fire, she would already see lamplight from the barn and hear the sounds of the animals being tended. He fixed things without being asked. He noticed what needed noticing. The north pasture fence that had been a disaster for months was straight and true within 2 weeks. The roof over the chicken coop that leaked every rain was patched by the end of the first week. He found 2 calves that had wandered into the creek brush and brought them back without drama. He was not much of a talker, and Mae was not either, which suited them both. But words began to appear naturally in the in-between spaces. Over coffee in the mornings when Mae brought a cup out to the barn. Over dinner when she set a place for him at the table because it seemed foolish not to. He was working on her property sunup to sundown. Over the fence sometimes in the early evenings when the work was done, and the light was going gold across the grass, and there was a natural pause that invited conversation. She learned that he was from Colorado originally, that he had spent 4 years on a cattle drive crew working the trails up from Texas, that he had briefly owned a small piece of land himself before a bad winter had taken his cattle and left him with nothing but debt. He had signed over the land to pay it and ridden south looking for something, though he did not say specifically what. He was 30 years old. He had never married, and when Mae asked why, he took a while to answer. "I suppose I never found anyone who made the idea of staying feel better than the idea of moving on," he said finally. Mae considered this and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She did not think about him romantically. She told herself this with some regularity because it was important to be clear-eyed about one's own motivations when one was a widow with a child and a mortgage and an enemy like Harlan Briggs already circling the property. Thomas had been dead 8 months. That was not long. Mae believed in the sanctity of grief, in giving it its proper time and space, and she also believed that Roscoe Crawford was an employee who was making her life substantially more manageable, and the last thing she needed was to muddy that arrangement with feelings she had no business having. But she noticed things. She noticed that he was careful with Lily, not falsely jolly or overly attentive in the way adults sometimes are with children they want to impress, but genuinely interested in what she had to say, asking her questions and listening to the answers. She noticed that he laughed sometimes at things she said, a real laugh that came from somewhere unguarded. She noticed that when he stood next to her to look at a map or a fence plan or a piece of equipment, he always left a respectful distance, never pressed into her space, never made her feel crowded or observed, which she appreciated enormously because she was a woman alone in the world and that kind of consideration was not a given. Harlan Briggs came back in November, this time with 2 men behind him, not ranch hands but something harder-edged, men who sat their horses with the particular stillness of people who were paid for more than cattle work. Mae was in the yard, and Roscoe was mending a wagon wheel near the barn when they rode in. Briggs smiled his careful smile. "I see you've taken on help, Mrs. Whitaker. A rancher without help is just a fool standing in a field," Mae said. Briggs's eyes moved to Roscoe with a measuring look, the kind that assigns categories quickly. "Your situation hasn't changed, as I understand it. The note at First National comes due in March. Ira Bellows at the bank has been a patient man, but patience has its season." "I have until March," Mae said. "That's my business and not yours." "I'm offering you a fair price," Briggs said, and he named a number. It was not a bad number, Mae admitted to herself privately. It would pay the mortgage and leave her with enough to start something modest in town, but it was not the point. The point was Thomas's grave under that oak tree. The point was Lily having something to grow up on and into. The point was that Mae Whitaker had looked into the face of hard things her whole life and had not yet found one that had broken her. "The answer is no," she said. "The answer will continue to be no." Briggs gave her a long look, still pleasant, still calm, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Then he turned his horse and his 2 men followed him, and they rode back toward the road at that same unhurried pace. When Mae turned around, Roscoe was standing a few feet behind her with the look of a man who had heard everything and was processing it carefully. "Briggs," he said, "Harlan Briggs. You know him, by reputation. He owns the land east of town, runs a big operation." Roscoe paused. "He's not the kind of man who takes no for a final answer." "Then he'll learn it from me," Mae said. Roscoe looked at her steadily. His eyes were gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and there was something in them right then that she did not have a word for yet. "Then I will help you keep it," he said simply, not as a question, not as an offer to be considered, just a statement of fact, like water runs downhill and the sun rises east. Mae looked at him for a moment that stretched a little longer than she intended. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I know that," he said. "I'm telling you what I'm going to do." Something shifted in Mae's chest that she did not acknowledge at the time, something small and warm and altogether inconvenient. She turned back toward the house and said over her shoulder, "Then I suppose we had better figure out how to make this place turn a profit by March." The planning began that same evening at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed. Mae spread out her papers, the mortgage document, her tallies of the cattle, her estimates of what she could produce and sell before spring. Roscoe sat across from her and looked at the numbers without emotion, just examined them the way you examine a problem that needs solving. "You've got 20 head," he said. "At market price this winter you might get $60, $70 for your culls. That's not enough on its own. I know that. Your hay supply is good. You've got more than you need to winter the cattle you're keeping." He looked up at her. "There's a market for hay. Ranches south of here have been short this season. If we bundle what you can spare and sell it, that's $30, maybe $40 more." Mae had not thought of the hay. She felt a small flush of something, not embarrassment exactly, but the particular feeling of having been working so hard you stop seeing the resources around you. "All right, what else?" "You have a kitchen garden that's done for the season, but if you planted winter wheat on the east quarter, come March you'd have something to sell or trade. It's a late start but not impossible." "I have seed," Mae said slowly. "Thomas bought seed last spring that we never got around to planting." Roscoe nodded. "I can break the ground if the weather holds. And the wagon." He tapped the paper. "You have a wagon and 2 good horses. Winter freighting work runs between Brecon Springs and Clarendon. I've done it before. 3 or 4 trips at $2 a load would add up." Mae looked at him across the table in the lamplight and felt an unexpected surge of something she could only call gratitude, though it was layered with things that gratitude alone did not quite cover. He was not doing this to impress her. He was doing it because a problem had been presented, and he was a man who addressed problems rather than retreating from them. "You would do the freighting runs?" she asked. "That takes you away from the ranch. You can manage the cattle for 2 or 3 days at a stretch," he said. "You were doing it before I came." "I was doing it badly," Mae admitted. "You were doing it alone," he said, and there was a gentleness in the distinction that made her look down at the papers. They worked through the numbers until the lamp burned low, and when they had a plan that might, with good weather and good luck, reach somewhere near that $140, Mae felt something she had not felt since March. She felt like the future was a thing that might actually arrive. December brought cold that settled bone-deep into the panhandle, turning the ground iron-hard and the creek to a skin of ice at the edges. Roscoe and Mae worked in the cold side by side, their breath clouding, their hands raw by mid-morning. He broke the east quarter ground in early December while the soil was still workable below the frost line, and they planted the winter wheat together, Mae dropping seed while Roscoe worked the soil behind her. And there was something so quietly intimate about that shared labor that Mae had to remind herself twice to breathe normally. Christmas came, the first Christmas without Thomas. Mae made a point of being brave about it for Lily's sake. She made molasses cookies and strung dried berries on a string for the tree, which was a small juniper Roscoe had cut from the creek hollow and stood up in the corner of the front room. He had done it without comment, just appeared one morning with the tree, and Mae had not asked him about it but had said thank you in a voice that contained more than the words themselves. On Christmas morning, Lily woke to find a carved wooden horse beside her stocking, small and detailed, clearly made with considerable care and considerable time. Me looked at it and then looked at Roscoe, who was standing in the doorway with his coffee cup, and he looked back at her with that quiet expression he wore when he was feeling things he did not know how to say. "You carved that?" Me asked quietly, while Lily galloped the horse across the floor. "Had some evenings to fill," he said. Me turned away quickly to attend to the stove because her eyes had done something unwelcome, and she needed a moment. They ate Christmas dinner together at the kitchen table, the three of them, and after Lily fell asleep on the settee in the front room, me and Roscoe sat for a while by the fire and talked. Really talked, more than they usually did, the way the winter dark and the warmth of the fire creates a kind of permission. He told her about Christmas as a boy in Colorado, his mother's cooking, his father who had been a blacksmith, the smell of the forge in winter. She told him about Missouri, about her parents who had both passed before she left for Texas, about how she had come west with such a mix of fear and excitement that she had barely slept the whole journey. "Were you happy here?" he asked. "With Thomas?" Me thought about it honestly, the way you can only think about things honestly when the person asking seems genuinely to want the truth and not reassurance. "We had good years," she said. "We built something real. He was a good man. He wasn't easy all the time, nobody is, but he was decent and he tried hard and he loved us." She paused. "I miss him. Not every minute the way I did at first, but I miss him." Roscoe nodded. He did not say anything false or consoling. He just accepted what she had said, and that acceptance was its own kind of comfort. "Do you get lonely?" he asked. "Out here?" "I was lonelier before you came," she said, and then immediately felt the vulnerability of having said it and added, "I mean, managing all of this alone, the work of it." "I know what you mean," he said, and she could not tell from his tone whether he was letting her off the hook or simply accepting both meanings. She went to bed that night with the warm and terrifying feeling that something was growing between them, whether she intended it or not. January was the hardest month. The cold deepened, and one of me's heifers had trouble birthing and nearly died, and Roscoe worked through a frozen night in the barn keeping the animal warm. And in the morning, both the heifer and the calf were alive, and me brought him hot coffee and found herself standing too close to him in the barn doorway, smelling the cold and the hay and the particular smell that was just him, leather and wood smoke and winter air, and she stepped back with her heart knocking against her ribs. Roscoe made 3 freighting runs in January, hauling goods between Brecon Springs and Clarendon, and he came back from the second one with news that tightened me's jaw. Harlan Briggs had been in conversation with Ira Bellows at the bank. Briggs had, by various means, positioned himself as the likely buyer of the Whitaker land should the mortgage not be met. He had apparently suggested to Bellows that the widow was not capable of managing the property, and that allowing the mortgage to come to term cleanly would serve everyone's interests. "He's trying to make sure the bank won't give you any grace period," Roscoe said. He said it plainly and directly because that was his way, and me appreciated it even as the news sat cold in her stomach. "He's within his rights to have conversations," me said carefully. "He's within his rights. What he's doing isn't against the law." Roscoe's jaw worked. "Doesn't make it right." "No," me agreed. "It doesn't." She sent a letter to Ira Bellows the next day, a formal letter, setting out her payment plan and her expected income from the hay sales and the freighting and the cattle and the wheat, and she signed it in her best hand and asked Roscoe to take it into town when he went for supplies. He came back to report that Bellows had received it and had been professionally noncommittal, which was not encouraging but was not defeat either. In February, the hay sold. A ranch down near Turkey Creek sent a man with a wagon to buy me's surplus, and she stood in the yard and counted the money he pressed into her hand, $42, and felt it like a small victory that was also a prayer for the larger one to come. Roscoe came in from tending the cattle one February afternoon to find me at the table writing in her ledger, and he set a bundle of something on the table beside her that turned out to be dried wildflowers, pale gold and straw white, the kind that somehow persist in Texas winters along sheltered creek banks. Me looked at them and then looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Found them by the creek," he said. "Thought they might be nice." Me touched one of the papery blooms with her fingertip. "They are nice," she said softly. He sat down across from her, and she was very aware of his presence in a way that had become both familiar and charged. Familiar because they had been sharing this kitchen for 3 months now. Charged because something had been building with the slow, inexorable patience of a river against a bank, and one of these days the bank was going to give. "Me," he said. He used her name carefully and directly, the way he used most things. She looked up at him. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know you can tell me it's none of my business," he said. "All right." "Are you all right?" he said. "Not the ranch. Are you all right?" The question was so simple and so direct and so unexpectedly kind that me felt something buckle in her chest, not break, just give slightly, like that moment when you have been holding yourself very straight for a very long time and someone offers you a place to lean. "I'm tired," she said honestly. "I'm very tired, and I'm scared about March even though I don't say it." "You don't have to not say it," he said. "Not to me." She looked at him across the table in the winter light, and the thing that had been building said, quietly but firmly, "You know what this is." And me did know. She had known it for a while. She just had not been ready to face it, had not thought she was allowed to feel it, had told herself it was too soon and too complicated and too tangled up with need and circumstance. "Roscoe," she said. "Yeah, I think you should know that I'm not." She stopped and started again. "I'm not a woman who confuses gratitude with something else. I know the difference." He was very still across the table. "I know that about you," he said. "What I'm feeling," she said carefully, "is not gratitude." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something settling into its proper place. Roscoe reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just rested it there, warm and certain, and me turned her hand over so their palms were together. "I didn't come here planning this," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that too," me said. "I came here because I needed work and you had a fence that needed fixing. And then you stayed." "And then I stayed," he agreed. He looked down at their joined hands. "I haven't wanted to stay anywhere in a long time." Me felt tears press at the back of her eyes, which annoyed her because she was not a woman who cried readily, and she blinked them back and said, "Well, you'd better keep staying until we've sorted out the mortgage at least." He laughed, that real unguarded laugh that she had been accumulating without meaning to, storing up like someone who knows winter is coming. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "at the very least." They did not kiss that night. It was not the right moment yet, and they both knew it without saying so. But something had been named that could not be unnamed, and the air between them had changed quality in a way that was impossible to mistake. In the first week of March, me tallied everything. The cattle sales, the hay money, the freighting income from 4 runs, the small amount she had set aside from selling vegetables and eggs over the winter. She added it once and then again, and then laid down her pencil and pressed her hands flat on the table. She had $111, $29 short. She sat with that number for a long time. Outside the window the morning light was thin and pale, the winter wheat in the east quarter pushing up green in defiance of the cold, evidence of labor and hope that might not now matter. $29 was not a mountain, but it might as well be. Roscoe found her like that when he came in from the barn. He looked at the papers and then at her face and read the situation without asking. "How short?" he said. $29. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have $37 saved." Me looked at him sharply. "That is your money." "I know whose money it is." "Roscoe, no." Me. He sat down across from her. "Listen to me. That land holds Thomas's grave. It holds Lily's birthplace. It holds the work you've put into it for 10 years. You think any amount of money in my pocket is worth more than that to me. You think I've been here 4 months and that means nothing." "It means everything," me said, and her voice came out rougher than she intended. That's why I cannot take your savings. Then consider it a loan, he said. Add it to my wages when the ranch turns profitable. Add it to whatever you want to call it. But we are not going to lose this place over $29. Me pressed her fingers to her lips and looked at the table. She was fighting herself, the prideful, independent part of her that had never in her life asked for help she had not earned, and the part that was starting to understand that accepting help from someone who offered it freely was not weakness but something closer to trust. I will pay you back every cent, she said. I know you will, Roscoe said. That was never in question. They rode into Brecon Springs the next morning together, me and Roscoe, on the wagon seat with the payment money in a leather pouch that me held on her lap. It was the 6th of March, 5 days before the payment was due, and the town was already beginning to feel the first suggestions of spring. A softness in the air, mud in the main street, a merchant sweeping his steps with the particular energy of someone welcoming a new season. Ira Bellows at First National Bank was a thin, careful man who wore his suits one size too large, and had the eyes of someone who has been told what to do by powerful men for so long that he has forgotten he ever had opinions of his own. He looked at me when she came through the door, and then he looked at Roscoe behind her, and then he looked at the leather pouch she set on his desk. $140, me said. Exact. I would like a receipt. Bellows counted the money twice with the methodical care of a man who wants to make sure there is no error he can exploit. There was not. He wrote out a receipt in his careful hand and pressed it across the desk. Me folded it and put it in her coat pocket with the precise deliberateness of someone placing a flag on a conquered hill. As they walked out of the bank onto the main street, me felt the world rearrange itself slightly around the fact that the land was hers, still hers, unmistakably hers for another year, and after that she would build toward the year after that. She stopped on the boardwalk and tilted her face up to the March sky, which was doing its best, pale blue with racing clouds and breathed. Roscoe stood beside her. He did not say anything. He was good at the necessary silences. Then me turned to him, and before she could think about whether it was the right moment or not, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was a brief kiss, direct and warm with all the intention in the world, and when she came back down to her heels, she found him looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something undefended and radiant and a little undone. "Well," he said, his voice low. "Well," she agreed. A woman passing on the boardwalk behind them gave a small surprised sound and kept walking. Me did not care in the slightest. Harlan Briggs was standing outside the hardware store across the street. He had seen. His expression was unreadable at that distance, just that smooth, patient surface that meant he was recalibrating. Me met his gaze across the width of the street and held it without flinching. Then she turned back to Roscoe and said, "Buy me a coffee before we drive home." He offered her his arm with the easy formality of a man who is not performing gallantry but genuinely means it. "I think I can manage that," he said. They sat in the small cafe on Main Street and drank coffee, and me noticed that Roscoe's hand found hers on the table and stayed there, and she let it, and the woman behind the counter was tactful enough not to remark on it. That evening, me stood in the south yard in the early dark and pressed her palm to the carved initials on the oak tree. She did this every evening still, this small ritual, and it still meant what it had always meant. But tonight it felt different. Not like letting go, but like adding something rather than subtracting. Thomas was there, in the grain of the tree and the soil of his grave and the shape of his daughter's face. He did not go anywhere just because Me's heart was doing something new. She thought she would have understood that Thomas. He had been a man who believed in living fully in the time you had, who had no patience for life held at a safe distance. She thought he would have looked at Roscoe Crawford and nodded and said something typically spare and typically Thomas, like that man knows how to work, which in Thomas's vocabulary was the highest possible compliment. Roscoe came to stand beside her in the yard without her hearing him approach, which was a thing he could do, move quietly over ground without announcing himself. He stood beside her at the tree and looked at the carving and said nothing. "His initials," Mae said. "And mine. He carved them the year we married." Roscoe looked at the carving for a long moment. "Good tree for it," he said. Mae smiled, the kind that comes from somewhere that hurts and somewhere that is happy at once. "It is," she said. His hand found hers in the dark, and they stood there together in the cold spring night with Thomas's grave visible in the moonlight at the fence line, and the land all around them quiet and enormous and full of whatever came next. Spring arrived with its customary extravagance on the Texas panhandle, the sky widening, the grass coming back green and urgent, the creek running high and clear with snowmelt from somewhere north. Mae's winter wheat came up strong in the east quarter, and she stood at the edge of it one April morning with her heart full of something that was almost too big to hold. Roscoe had already begun making improvements to the ranch that went beyond the immediate necessities, the kind of improvements that spoke of a person planning to be somewhere for a long time. He built a proper storage shed alongside the barn that would keep the hay dry through the next winter. He repaired the root cellar door that had been hanging wrong since the previous summer. He spent a week rebuilding the section of fence along the north pasture line, doing it right, with good post depth and proper wire tension. Mae noticed the way he approached these improvements, not as tasks assigned to him, but as things he was invested in because he had begun to consider the place his own responsibility in some important way. She noticed, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the spring temperature. Their courtship, if one could call it that, unfolded with the same quiet deliberateness with which they both approached most things. There was no grand declaration, no formal ceremony of feeling. There were evenings on the porch in the spring dusk, talking or not talking, both equally comfortable. There was a Sunday afternoon when Roscoe taught Lily to identify bird calls, patient and thorough, naming each one, and Mae sat on the porch watching them in the yard and felt something crystallize in her chest with a clarity that could not be walked back from. He kissed her properly for the first time on a warm April evening when they were checking the fence in the east pasture, and the sun was going down in colors that had no reasonable name. They had been walking side by side, and he had stopped and turned to her, and she had known what was coming and had turned to him with everything open. No careful measurement this time, no self-protective calculation. The kiss was the kind that says something permanent, that makes a promise without requiring words to carry the weight. When it was over, Mae pressed her forehead against his shoulder for a moment, just briefly, and then straightened and said, "We should check the rest of the fence." Roscoe laughed softly against her hair. "We should," he agreed, but neither of them moved for another minute. Harlan Briggs made one more attempt. It came in May, not in person this time, but through a lawyer from Amarillo named Chadwick, a neat-suited man who arrived with papers that he called a formal purchase offer, and Mae called wasted paper. He explained the offer in careful detail, and Mae explained her position in equally careful detail, and Chadwick went back to Amarillo with nothing to show for his trip. A week after Chadwick's visit, 2 of Briggs's riders came through Mae's north pasture and cut a section of fence. It was the kind of thing that was impossible to prove and easy to do, and when Mae and Roscoe found the damage in the morning and the 3 cattle that had wandered through the gap, Mae stood looking at the cut wire with her jaw tight and her eyes bright with something that was adjacent to fury. "He's trying to harass us," Roscoe said. "I know what he's doing," Mae said. "You could go to Sheriff Aldred." "What evidence?" Mae said. "Wire gets cut, cattle wander, it happens." Roscoe crouched beside the cut end of the wire and examined it. "This was deliberate," he said. "It's been cut clean, not broken." "It was deliberate," Mae agreed, "and I cannot prove it was Briggs's men." Roscoe straightened and looked at her with the particular steady quality he had when he was thinking through something seriously. "Then we fix the fence and we don't give him the satisfaction of seeing it bother us," he said. "And we keep making this place stronger. That's the answer to Harlan Briggs. Make it so indisputably solid and productive that he can't touch it." Mae looked at him for a moment. That is a very patient strategy. I'm a patient man, he said. I'm beginning to understand that, Mae said, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her quickly and find her smiling, and he shook his head and went to get the wire. They fixed the fence that morning and rounded up the stray cattle before noon, and the afternoon was spent on other things, and the sun went down on the Whitaker place with everything in order, and Mae decided that was exactly what victory over Harlan Briggs looked like. Not a dramatic confrontation, but simply the ordinary going-on of a life being lived well on land that would not be surrendered. The wheat came to harvest in late May, early for winter wheat, but the season had cooperated, and Mae and Roscoe spent 3 hard days cutting and bundling, working from first light to last, coming in each evening sunburned and aching and full of the particular satisfaction of work that produces something real. Lily helped carry bundles and felt enormously important doing it, which Mae made sure to tell her she was. They sold the wheat to a mill in Clarendon for a price that made Mae sit down briefly when she heard it, because it was better than she had expected by a significant margin. With that income and the regular cattle sales and the ongoing freighting work, she was looking at a year that could genuinely build toward the next March payment rather than scramble toward it. She paid Roscoe back his $37 from the first month's profit, pressing the bills into his hand with a formality that was also a kind of ceremony. He accepted them the same way. "Thank you," she said, "for trusting me with it. That was never something I had to decide," he said simply. In June, Roscoe asked me to walk with him to the creek hollow one evening, and Mae put Lily to bed early with a story and went out into the warm summer dark to find him waiting at the pasture gate with his hat in his hands, which was not his usual posture, and which told her something significant was about to happen. They walked down to the creek in the sound of frogs and the smell of summer grass, and at the spot where the bank curved and there was a flat stone they had sat on before to talk, he turned to her and took both her hands. He was not a man who made speeches. She had known this for 8 months, so what came out was exactly what he meant without any decoration around it. "I love you," he said. "I love your daughter. I love this land and what you've made of it and what you're making of it. And I'm not going anywhere, but I want to know if you'll have me here properly. As your husband, if that's something you can want." Mae looked at him in the creekside dark with the water moving past them and the summer all around them and Thomas's 10 years of love for this place, and for her settled somewhere inside her not as a weight but as a foundation, something you build on rather than something that holds you in place. "I can want it," she said. "I do want it." He exhaled, a slow breath that told her he had been genuinely uncertain, which she found both surprising and deeply moving, that this steady, capable man had been afraid of her answer. She stepped closer to him and put her hands on either side of his face, which was rough with several days of not shaving and warm from the summer evening, and she kissed him with everything she had been holding at a careful distance for months, and he pulled her close with his arms around her, and the creek talked over its stones beside them, and the night was full and warm and complete. They were married in September of 1882 in Brecon Springs, at the small church on the edge of town, with its whitewashed walls and its crooked steeple that had been crooked since a windstorm in 1879, and would likely remain so until another windstorm made a decision one way or the other. Reverend Caldwell performed the service, a compact, earnest man who chose his scripture carefully and kept his homily brief, which Mae appreciated. Mae wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the Sears catalog, a deep blue that the catalog described as navy, but which in the September light looked the color of a late afternoon sky. Lily wore her best dress and a wreath of dried flowers on her head that she had refused to take off since Mae placed it there that morning. She stood beside Mae through the ceremony with the grave importance of a child who understands that this is a moment she will remember. The town turned out in reasonable numbers. There were people who liked Mae and had respected her fight to keep the land. There were also people who came for curiosity's sake, because a widow marrying her hired hand was the kind of thing that generated talk. But me had long since decided that other people's talk was weather, something you dress for and move through and don't allow to stop you. Tom Aldred, the sheriff who had known me since before Thomas died, pumped Roscoe's hand at the reception afterward and said, "You take care of her." Roscoe said, "She mostly takes care of herself. I'm mostly just trying to keep up." And me, who had heard this from 3 feet away, felt such a rush of warmth that she had to busy herself with the wedding cake for a moment. Harlan Briggs did not attend. No one expected him to. What Briggs did, in October of that year, was buy a competing section of land to the north of me's property and announce plans for a large cattle operation that would presumably make the Whitaker land increasingly surrounded and increasingly pressured. It was the kind of move that powerful men with long grudges make when they cannot win directly. Me and Roscoe discussed it one evening and reached the same conclusion, that the best response was continued improvement, continued productivity, and the passing of time, because time was the thing Briggs could not manufacture, and me had it in abundance if she kept the land. Winter came again, and this time it came to a different house, not different in its boards and beams, but different in its feeling. The barn had a third horse in it, Roscoe's Jupiter, who had apparently decided to be friends with me's mare Clara despite an initial period of mutual suspicion. The kitchen fire was tended by 2 pairs of hands. The evenings were longer and better, and Lily slept soundly, knowing the shape of things was settled. Me was pregnant by December. She found out on a cold morning when the evidence became undeniable, and she stood at the window for a long time looking at the winter land and feeling the enormity of it. Not fear exactly, but the full weight of something enormous and beautiful arriving in a life that had already been through enough to teach her not to take enormous beautiful things lightly. She told Roscoe that evening after Lily was in bed. She said it simply, the way they both tended to say important things. He was quiet for a moment, very still, and then he made a sound that was not quite a word but was entirely expressive, a low, stunned exhale of wonder, and he pulled her against him and held her with his face in her hair, and she could feel the particular trembling quality of a person who is trying not to cry and finding it a close contest. "You all right?" he managed. "I'm wonderful," she said, and meant it without reservation. "Me too," he said. "I'm wonderful too." She laughed and he laughed with her, and outside the January wind swept across the panhandle and found the Whitaker Crawford homestead locked up tight and warm within itself, indifferent to its efforts. The pregnancy was straightforward, as me's pregnancies tended to be, not without discomfort but without drama. She worked through most of it with the pragmatic approach of a woman who does not have the luxury of being fragile, though Roscoe monitored her activities with a thoughtfulness that occasionally crossed into fussing, which me told him plainly she did not require. "I hauled water when I was 8 months along with Lily," she pointed out. "That was before I was here," he said. "Let me haul the water." Me let him haul the water. In March of 1883, they made the second mortgage payment without scrambling, without borrowing, with enough margin left over that me began to allow herself to think in terms of paying off the note entirely in a few more years. She wrote to the bank with the payment and did not visit in person because she did not need to prove anything to Ira Bellows and preferred to spend the time on something useful. Spring arrived, and with it the birth of me and Roscoe's son in April of 1883. He arrived early in the morning when the light was just coming pink over the eastern pasture, and Roscoe was there through all of it, steady and quiet and present in the way that mattered. And when the baby drew his first breath and made his opinion of the world known in the traditional manner, Roscoe sat on the edge of the bed with the baby in his arms and looked at him with an expression me would remember for the rest of her life. They named him Samuel Thomas Crawford, Samuel for no one in particular, but because it suited him, and Thomas for the man whose grave was under the oak tree, and whose presence was still in the wood of the house and the soil of the land, and whose daughter sat at the foot of the bed in her nightdress, demanding to hold her brother immediately. Mae watched Roscoe hold Samuel and watched Lily hold Samuel under Roscoe's careful supervision, and she lay against her pillows in the morning light of her own house on her own land, and felt a completeness that she had not been certain the world still owed her. By summer of 1883, the Whitaker Crawford Ranch, which they had formally renamed Crawford Ranch in the spring, though Mae privately continued to think of it as their ranch rather than anyone's particular property, was running 28 head of cattle, had its winter wheat established as a reliable seasonal crop, and had built a small additional income from selling eggs and produce to a Brecon Springs merchant who was happy to have reliable local suppliers. Roscoe had also, with the help of a neighbor named Gus Pereira who ran a small spread to the west, established a modest horse-breaking operation, working young horses through the late summer and selling them to ranches that needed reliable working animals. Roscoe was good with horses in the way some people are good with music, not just technically skilled, but possessing some quality of communication that the animals responded to. Mae watched him work a young horse one late summer afternoon and felt a pride in him that was physical, that sat warm in the center of her chest. Lily was 7 now and attending the Brecon Springs school, which she found simultaneously fascinating and insufficient, bringing home books that she read through in days and returning for more with the appetite of a child who had been given an intellectual gift and was determined to use it. She had accepted Roscoe with the complete and uncomplicated loyalty of a child who has been treated well and consistently, and she called him Pa now without prompting, which Roscoe had said nothing about at the time except to look away briefly at something in the distance that apparently required his attention. Samuel grew into a plump, determined baby, and then into a toddler who regarded the horses with ambitions that were advanced for his size, and who followed Roscoe around the yard whenever he could escape his mother's supervision, which Roscoe found endlessly amusing. Harlan Briggs's northern operation proved to be somewhat less threatening in practice than it had seemed in plan. The land he had bought was harder country, prone to drainage problems, and he had overstocked it in the first year and lost cattle to a wet winter fever. By late 1883, it was clear that his attention had moved to other ventures south of Amarillo, and the particular pressure he had applied to the Whitaker place eased the way weather eases, gradually and without ceremony. Mae noted this shift without celebration. She had learned not to celebrate the retreat of problems but to use the breathing room to make herself stronger, so that the next problem, whatever form it took, would find her more prepared. The second March payment was made comfortably. The third, in 1884, was made with enough surplus that Mae paid an extra $20 against the principal and felt it like a physical pleasure. She began to see the end of the mortgage not as a distant dream, but as an arithmetic problem with a calculable solution. The town of Brecon Springs grew in these years, as Texas towns were growing, the railroad talk that had been just talk for years beginning to solidify into surveys, and then into actual iron laid north through the panhandle. When the rail line came through in late 1884, it changed everything about the economics of ranching and farming in the region, because suddenly the markets that had required long hauls by wagon were accessible at a fraction of the cost and time. Roscoe saw the opportunity before most people in the area and moved on it quickly, securing a contract to supply beef cattle to a Clarendon buyer who had railroad connections and was looking for reliable regional suppliers. The first cattle shipment went out in early 1885, and the return on it was enough to make me stare at the numbers for some time before she trusted them. "We need more cattle," she said. "We need more land," Roscoe said, "or at least grazing rights. There's a section north of the creek that borders Gus's place. He's thinking of selling. Been talking about going back to California." Mae thought about it for a week, which was how long she generally needed to make a large decision, and then said, "Let's talk to Gus." They bought Gus Pereira's eastern quarter in spring of 1885, expanding the Crawford Ranch by a third and giving them access to excellent creek bank grazing that had been underused under Gus's management. Gus was happy enough to be bought out fairly and headed for California with his earnings and Mae's preserves as a farewell gift. She had liked Gus and was sorry to lose a good neighbor, but Roscoe's assessment that the land was an opportunity proved entirely correct. By 1885, they had 45 head of cattle, a profitable horse operation, the established wheat crop, and the railroad contract. Mae sat down one autumn evening and looked at the numbers and looked at Roscoe across the table and said, "We're going to be all right." He had been waiting for her to say it, she could tell. He had known it for a while but had known better than to say it before she had arrived at the conclusion herself. "We are," he said. "This place is going to be worth something real," she said, "for Samuel and for Lily. They'll have something to stand on," he agreed. Mae looked down at the ledger and then up at the ceiling and then at her husband and said, "I used to be so afraid, after Thomas died. I used to stand in the yard at night and be afraid of everything that might take this away. I couldn't even name all the things I was afraid of." "I know," Roscoe said quietly. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact offered with a kind of wonder at itself. Roscoe reached across the table. She gave him her hand. Outside, the autumn wind moved over the grass of the Crawford Ranch, which had been the Whitaker Ranch and would be the Crawford Ranch for as long as either of them could see. And the night was full of ordinary sounds: the horses in the barn, the faint cry of an owl somewhere in the creek bottom, and somewhere in the house, the breathing of two sleeping children who would wake tomorrow in a place that was entirely theirs. The fifth mortgage payment, made in March of 1887, was also the last. Mae and Roscoe drove into Brecon Springs together on a cold March morning, and Mae set the final payment on Ira Bellows's desk, $140 plus a final installment against the principal, and Bellows produced the deed with the professional manner of a man performing a transaction. But Mae noticed that even he, cautious and colorless as he was, had a brief involuntary expression that was something like respect. She held the deed in her hands for a moment in Bellows's office. The paper was dry and formal, full of the legal language that encodes possession in the terms of law, but what it said to me, underneath all of it, was, "This land is yours and no one can take it." She had known this for a long time, but holding the paper made it true in a different way. Outside the bank on the same boardwalk where she had kissed Roscoe after the first payment 5 years ago, Mae stopped and tilted her face to the same pale March sky. Roscoe stood beside her. Lily, who was 12 now and had insisted on coming along because she understood the significance, stood on Mae's other side. Samuel, who was 4 and did not fully understand the significance, but understood that this was important and was therefore treating it with 4-year-old solemnity, stood at Roscoe's side holding his father's hand. "Well," Mae said to the sky, and then to Roscoe, and then to her children, "that's done." "That's done," Roscoe agreed. Lily said, "Can we get pie? You said we could get pie if everything went well." "Everything went exceedingly well," Mae said. "Get your brother." They had pie at the cafe on Main Street, the same cafe where Mae and Roscoe had drunk coffee on that first day 5 years ago with their hands touching on the table. The woman behind the counter, whose name was Grace, and who had observed with approval the entire arc of Mae and Roscoe Crawford over these years, set down extra slices without being asked, and waved away the extra payment with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own establishment. The ride home in the late afternoon light was long and easy and unhurried. Lily had a book on her lap and was reading, immune to landscape the way readers sometimes are. Samuel had fallen asleep against Mae's side before they left the edge of town. Mae held him with one arm and with her other hand held Roscoe's on the wagon seat. The ranch came into view as the light was going amber and long across the panhandle, the house and barn solid against the sky, the east quarter's new growth showing green, the cattle visible as dark shapes in the north pasture, and the oak tree in the south yard holding its own against the season the way it always had. Thomas's grave was there, as it always was, the wooden cross replaced now by a proper stone marker that Mae had commissioned from a man in Clarendon, Thomas Whitaker, beloved husband and father, 1848–1882, with a simple verse that Thomas himself had been fond of. Mae looked at the grave as they drove in and felt what she always felt, a grief that was soft now rather than sharp, a love that did not require the beloved to be present in order to be real. And beside it, inseparable from it, the life she had built on the land he had loved, with a man who had shown up at a fence that needed fixing and had stayed. Roscoe helped her down from the wagon, and she carried Samuel inside while he and Lily tended the horses, and Roscoe fed the cattle their evening grain. Mae laid Samuel in his bed still sleeping and went to the kitchen and built up the fire and put the kettle on, and stood at the window watching the last of the daylight fall out of the western sky. She thought about the woman she had been 8 years ago, stepping down from a Missouri stage with everything she owned, and a young man's hand extended to help her, Thomas Whitaker with his honest face and his piece of panhandle land and his absolute certainty that they could build something there. She thought about the woman she had been 5 years ago, standing on her porch telling Harlan Briggs that her answer would always be no, fierce and frightened in equal measure. She thought about the woman she had become. The door opened and Roscoe came in, bringing the smell of the October evening with him, hay and cold air and the horses. He washed his hands at the basin, and Lily came in behind him and announced that she was hungry, and Mae said dinner in 20 minutes, and the kitchen filled with the particular sound of a family in its ordinary evening, the sound she had not known she needed until she had them. After dinner, after Lily had gone to her room with her book and Samuel had been put to bed for the second time, Mae and Roscoe sat on the porch in their coats in the autumn dark. The stars were extravagant over the panhandle, which had always been one of the things Mae loved about this country, the sheer excess of the night sky. "What are you thinking about?" Roscoe asked after a comfortable while. "Thomas," Mae said, "and you, and how one thing leads to another in ways you can't predict." "That's true enough," he said. "I was going to refuse Briggs and fight alone," she said. "That was my plan, just fight alone until I ran out of ways to fight." "You might have managed it," Roscoe said, and he meant it, which was one of the things she loved about him. "Maybe," Mae said, "but I'm glad I didn't have to." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she did now with the ease of years of habit, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the starlight on the porch of the house that was theirs above a land that was theirs, and the night moved around them and the frogs sang from the creek hollow, and somewhere a coyote called once and was answered from a distance, and then silence returned. "I want to build onto the house next spring," Roscoe said. "Add a proper room on the east side. Give Lily more space before she's grown and gone." "She would love that," Mae said. "She's been doing her reading in the kitchen because the light is better and she's too polite to say her room is small." "I noticed," he said. Mae smiled into his shoulder. "You notice everything." "I notice you," he said, "mostly." She looked up at him in the dark, at his face that she knew as well now as she knew the land, and said, "I love you, Roscoe Crawford." He looked at her with that expression she had first seen on the boardwalk in front of the bank 5 years ago, that open, undefended look that still undid her every time. "I love you, Mae Crawford," he said, "every season of it." He kissed her in the starlight in the October dark, and the porch was solid underfoot, and the land held still around them, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. Spring came again to the Crawford ranch the following year, as it reliably did, in the Texas way, sudden and green, and a little overwhelming in its insistence on renewal. Roscoe built the addition onto the east side of the house through April and May, with help from 2 ranch hands he had taken on the previous autumn, good men named Pete Vargas and Wade Coleman, who were hardworking and dependable, and who treated me with the respectful directness she required of people who worked on her property. Lily got her bigger room in June, and promptly filled it with books acquired through careful management of her allowance and occasional persuasion of her parents to order things from the catalog. She was 13 now and fiercely intelligent, and had told me in a serious conversation that she intended to be a schoolteacher when she was grown, which me took seriously and encouraged with the same intensity she brought to everything that mattered. Samuel turned 5 in April and was given a small job of his own, feeding the chickens each morning, which he performed with immense seriousness and occasional terror when the rooster objected to his presence. Roscoe helped him navigate the rooster situation with patient instruction until Samuel could hold his ground, and me watched from the kitchen window one morning as her small son faced down the indignant bird with his hands on his hips, and felt a laughter rise in her chest that was also entirely a form of love. The ranch grew steadily in those following years. The railroad contract expanded. Roscoe's horse-breaking operation developed a reputation in the region for producing reliable working animals. Me's management of the finances remained sharp and forward-looking, and she had learned to read markets with an accuracy that sometimes surprised the men who traded in them and who had not expected a woman in a ranch house kitchen to have a clear understanding of cattle prices in 4 different markets. Harlan Briggs was not entirely gone from the picture. He was a persistent presence on the edge of things in Brecon Springs, still influential, still wealthy, still the kind of man who got what he wanted through means that were technically within the law but not always within the spirit of it. But the Crawford Ranch was no longer vulnerable in the ways it had been, and Briggs was a practical man beneath his arrogance. He had moved his attentions to other opportunities and other targets, and me and Roscoe had simply made themselves too established, too productive, and too clearly rooted to be worth the effort of dislodging. Me encountered Briggs at the Mercantile in Brecon Springs one October afternoon in 1888, and they passed each other with the formal courtesy of people who have had a conflict that is now historical rather than active. Briggs tipped his hat. Me inclined her head. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. It was enough. Me was pregnant again by the autumn of 1888, which she discovered with rather less surprise than the first time but no less wonder. She and Roscoe sat with this news one quiet evening, and there was a happiness between them that was seasoned now, not the stunned amazement of the first time but something deeper and more confident, the happiness of people who know what they are doing and are glad of the opportunity to do it again. This time it was a girl, born in the early summer of 1889 with Thomas's dark eyes and Roscoe's strong hands, and a set of opinions she began expressing immediately and did not show any signs of reconsidering. They named her Clara Mae Crawford, Clara for the mare who had been the ranch's first horse and was now elderly and comfortable in the pasture, and Mae for a tradition of women who knew what they wanted and went after it. Lily was 14 when Clara was born and embraced the role of older sister with characteristic thoroughness, reading to the baby with the same earnest dedication she brought to everything, teaching her things months ahead of when they might be useful. Samuel, who was 6, regarded his new sister with the mixture of curiosity and uncertain acceptance that 6-year-old boys typically bring to the addition of a female sibling, and gradually came around when Clara demonstrated an early interest in the horses that seemed to him like a point in her favor. The decade turned and Mae Whitaker Crawford was 38 years old, and the Crawford Ranch was a going concern, solid and productive and paid for, with good cattle and good horses and good land, and a house that had grown to match the family within it. She had gray at her temples now, which she did not mind, and the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work and strong feeling and the full range of weather that life provides. She stood one October morning in the south yard with Clara on her hip, the baby's dark eyes examining the world with the focused attention of a person who intends to understand it thoroughly, and pressed her palm to the initials on the oak tree in the old way, the morning ritual, Thomas's TC and her own MW cut into the bark a lifetime ago on a morning when everything was possibility and none of the losses had happened yet. "Hello," she said to the tree. "Hello, Thomas. Look what we made of it." Roscoe came across the yard from the barn with Jupiter moving beside him on a loose lead, the old horse gray-muzzled now and steady as a clock. He stopped beside me and looked at the tree with the quiet understanding of a man who has been told about this ritual and has never once commented on it or suggested it was unnecessary. He just stopped and stood and let the moment be what it was. Clara reached out and put her small hand on the bark beside me's, because babies will mirror the actions of the people they love without understanding why, and it was such a perfect small thing that me felt tears warm at her eyes and did not try to prevent them. "Morning," Roscoe said. "Morning," me said, and looked at him, her husband of 7 years, gray himself at the edges, still straight-backed and careful and honest, still the man who had offered to fix a fence for a meal, still the man who had looked at her across a kitchen table with her husband's grave visible through the window and said then, "I will help you keep it," as though the words were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I'm grateful," me said. "For all of it. Even the hard parts." Roscoe nodded slowly, looking at the land around them, the east quarter's stubble, the cattle in the north pasture, the house with its new east side rooms, the barn with its horses, the fence lines running true across the autumn grass. He had been thinking his own version of what she was thinking, she knew. He was always thinking something alongside what she was thinking. "This place is good," he said. "What you built here is good." "What we built," me said. He took her hand, the one not holding Clara, and held it in his warm, certain way. "What we built," he agreed. They walked back to the house together in the morning light of a day that was asking to be ordinary and would be, comfortably and beautifully ordinary, full of work and children and the reliable company of each other. And the land stretched around them in every direction, patient and enormous and entirely theirs. Lily went to Teachers College in Amarillo in 1891, which was a departure that required me to be very composed in the days before, and very much less composed the evening after the stage pulled away. Roscoe found her on the porch that evening and sat beside her and said nothing at all, which was exactly right. Lily wrote letters that arrived weekly and were full of the breathless detail of a mind encountering new ideas faster than it can organize them, and me read every letter twice and kept them in a box. Samuel took to the ranch work with the wholehearted commitment of a young man who has always known what he loves. At 10, he was more useful than many hired hands, and by 13 Roscoe trusted him with the cattle work independently, which Samuel received not with pride exactly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been given a real thing to do and intends to do it well. Clara grew up talking to horses before she talked to most people, which the horses seemed to prefer, and when she was 3, she could name every animal on the property, and when she was 5 she was riding with her father in the early mornings, small and straight-backed and absolutely determined on Jupiter's gentle back. The mortgage was long paid. The land was theirs without qualification. The Crawford Ranch in the Texas Panhandle outside Breckin Springs was a known and respected operation, and Mae Crawford was a known and respected person in the region, which she had earned not through any particular ambition for reputation, but simply through the consistent application of honesty and hard work over many years. Harlan Briggs sold his northern section in 1892 and retired to a house in Amarillo, reportedly in poor health. Me heard this through the usual channels of small-town information and felt nothing in particular about it. She had not spent much energy hating him. She had spent energy building things, which is a more sustainable occupation. The year 1892 was also the year me decided to teach. Not in a school building, she was too rooted to the ranch for that, but she had noticed that several families in the neighboring spread had children who were not attending school in Breckin Springs because the distance was too great, children who were growing up without the letters and numbers that would make the world navigable to them. She began a twice-weekly session in the ranch kitchen, 6 children ranging from 7 to 12, with textbooks she ordered from a publisher in Dallas, and a structure she had developed from watching Lily and from her own memory of being taught. Roscoe watched this enterprise develop with the particular expression he wore when Mae did something that didn't surprise him but that he found genuinely admirable. He converted the storage room off the kitchen into a proper schoolroom with a proper table and benches without being asked. "What made you do this?" she asked him one evening when the schoolroom was finished. "You needed more space," he said. "The kitchen's your kitchen." "That's not the real answer," Mae said. He was quiet for a moment. "Because those children need what you can give them," he said finally. "And you have it to give, and you'll give it better with a proper space." He looked at her with that steady, direct way he had. "And because watching you teach makes me proud. There. Is that better?" Mae kissed him on the cheek. "Much better," she said. The schoolroom was in use within a week. By 1895, the ranch kitchen school had grown to 12 students and had come to the attention of the county, which offered to formalize it and provide a small stipend if Mae would expand the sessions to 4 days a week. Mae negotiated the terms carefully, insisted on maintaining control of the curriculum, and accepted the arrangement. She was 41 years old and running a ranch and a school and a household, and found the combination entirely manageable. Lily had finished teacher's college and was teaching in Amarillo, which was not as far as it might have been. She came home for Christmas and summers and wrote her letters. Samuel was 16 and as capable as any man on the ranch, with his father's eye for livestock and his mother's head for numbers. Clara was 6 and writing well and asking questions at a rate that suggested she intended to understand everything about the world before she was 10. The Christmas of 1895 was the fullest the house had ever been. Lily came home and brought with her a young man from Amarillo named Joseph Hargreave, who was a printer's apprentice and clearly in love with Lily in the wholehearted, uncomplicated way of young men who have found something worth being wholehearted about. Mae observed him over 3 days of Christmas and found him acceptable, which was the strongest endorsement she gave to anyone on first meeting. Roscoe watched Lily with her young man with the expression of a father who is proud of his daughter and slightly protective of her, and entirely aware that both feelings are his business and not hers. He managed this gracefully, which Mae had not doubted he would. Christmas dinner in 1895 was Mae and Roscoe and Lily and Joseph and Samuel and Clara, and the table was full and loud in the good way, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously and Lily explaining printing presses to Samuel, who was genuinely interested, and Clara asking Joseph whether he had a horse, and if not, why not. Roscoe carved the beef and caught Mae's eye across the table, and the look they exchanged required nothing verbal to be complete. After dinner, when the dishes were done and the children were occupied in the front room and Joseph had been deputized to read to Clara, Mae and Roscoe sat at the kitchen table in the quiet way they always did, in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been together long enough that silence is its own language. "This is a good Christmas," Mae said. "This is the best Christmas," Roscoe said, which was the same thing he said every Christmas, and which was true every Christmas in a slightly different way. Mae looked at the kitchen around her, the room she had cooked in and argued in and cried in and planned in and loved in for 13 years. The lamp on the table. The stove that needed a new door plate in spring. The window that looked out over the south yard, where the oak tree stood in the winter dark with its carved initials that she would go and touch in the morning as she always did, and would feel Thomas there as she always did, steady and present in the way that people remain present in the places they loved. She looked at her husband. He was 53 and she was 41, and his hair was silver at the temples, and the years of outdoor work had put weather into his face, which she found entirely beautiful the way you find beautiful the things you know completely. He was looking at the middle distance with the expression that meant he was content, the expression she had learned to read as meaning everything is right. "Roscoe," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for fixing the fence." He understood exactly what she meant. He always did. The corner of his mouth moved. "You offered me beans," he said. "It seemed fair." Me laughed, and he laughed, and in the front room Samuel said something that made Lily burst into the uncontrolled laughter of someone caught entirely off guard, and Clara's higher voice joined in without necessarily knowing what was funny. And the Crawford house on the Crawford Ranch in the Texas Panhandle was full to its rafters with exactly the kind of sound that makes a house into something more than its boards and its roof. Me reached across the table and took her husband's hand. The land was theirs. The family was theirs. The life was theirs. Thomas's grave sat quiet under the December stars beyond the window, and the carved oak stood guard in the south yard, and the cattle breathed warm in the north pasture, and everything that had been fought for and built for and refused to be surrendered was right here, solid and certain and fully, wholly theirs. And that was where the story settled, not into an ending exactly, because the ranch would go on, and the seasons would come, and Lily would marry her printer, and Samuel would take over more and more of the cattle work, and Clara would turn out to be as horse-smart as anyone had ever seen, and me would teach a generation of Panhandle children their letters. And Roscoe would one morning come in from the barn and sit down at the kitchen table and say the north pasture gate needs a new hinge, and me would say, "I know, I saw it yesterday," and they would both go out together to fix it. Because that was how they had always done things, and that was how they always would, side by side on the land they had refused to let go of, the land that was worth refusing for, in the life that had been worth every fight and every cold morning, and every page of numbers in the ledger, and every moment of doubt that had resolved, as the best moments of doubt do, into something truer and stronger and more fully inhabited than anything that doubt had threatened to take away. The Crawford Ranch stood. Mae Whitaker Crawford stood. And beside her, as he always was, Roscoe Crawford stood. The wide Texas sky held them all in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful hand. And the wind moved over the grass the way the wind has always moved over that country, free and unhurried, and carrying everything forward into whatever came next.